This is a new year, and we have left the Gospel of Matthew with his weeping and gnashing of teeth, and we will be spending most of this year in the Gospel of Mark. I thought we should spend a little bit of time finding out more about the author of Mark and what he was trying to say about Jesus that is different than the other Gospels. Mark is widely recognized by most biblical scholars as the earliest gospel written. It's, as it seems, Matthew and Luke use Mark as one of the sources of their gospels. It is thought to have been written somewhere around the years 65 to 70 CE. It was written in Greek, which means, contrary to popular folklore, it most likely wasn't written by Mark, the secretary of Peter, as some scholars believe it was. Mark is the action gospel. Everyone in Mark is always in a hurry. The gospel is full of the word immediately. And Mark is also a pointer. He's not a painter in his writing style. Just the facts, ma'am. He doesn't waste time setting up the story of Jesus' ministry. There are no shepherds, no angels, no wise men here, no long line of ancestors. For Mark, it begins with Jesus as an adult. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee. From the very beginning, Mark makes it very clear to us, the readers, just who this Jesus is, the Son of God, though everyone else seems to remain clueless until the very end. It is commonly called the Messianic secret. Mark's focus on Jesus is as the suffering Messiah. Unlike the popular thought of the time, Mark shows that Jesus didn't come in power to overthrow the Roman Empire or as a mighty king in this life, but as a humble servant who came to suffer and die at the hands of the people, for the people, by the people. Instead of weeping and gnashing of teeth that we found throughout Matthew's gospel and showing Jesus as the traditional powerful Jewish Messiah who would judge the sheep from the goats, instead, Mark emphasizes the servant Messiah who suffers for us even to the point of death. And that anyone who wishes to be a disciple should also pick up their cross and follow on that same journey. Mark uses the desert or wilderness as a place for preparation. John comes from the desert to prepare the way. After today's reading, the Spirit will drive Jesus immediately into the desert to prepare him for his time of ministry. The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Later, in the wilderness or desert, the disciples are tested and, like the Israelites, do not have faith that God can provide bread in the wilderness. By contrast, just as Moses' faith brought forth the manna, Jesus' faith allows him to provide bread for all. Mark's Jesus is also always on the way. The opening prophecy twice refers to the way, anticipating the journey of ministry that happens throughout Mark. John prepares the way for Jesus, and later Jesus will send the disciples out and instructs them to take nothing on the way. When Jesus begins his journey to Jerusalem, the way is used 8 times to help describe the journey, the way of God. What I really find fascinating in Mark is that the beginning and the ending of Jesus' ministry are like matching bookends. There's a cluster of similar happenings. Something in both of those stories is torn. Here it is the heavens. At his death it is the temple veil. At both moments a voice is heard declaring Jesus to be the Son of God. At his baptism it is God, while at his death it is the centurion. And finally, at both, the prophet Elijah is symbolically present. At the baptism in the form of John the Baptist, while at Jesus' death, the onlookers think that Jesus is calling out to Elijah. But what I find most interesting is the tearing of the heavens and the tearing of the veil. Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived at the time of Jesus, describes the veil that separated the Holy of Holies in the temple from the people. It was, he says, a gigantic curtain 80 feet high, a Babylonian tapestry with embroidery of blue and fine linen of scarlet and purple wrought with marvelous skill. Then Josephus goes on to tell us what was pictured on the curtain. Portrayed on this tapestry was a panorama of the entire heaven. So we see the heavens being torn open at the baptism and at the end of Jesus' ministry. In Mark's gospel, when Jesus came sputtering up out of the water and looks up, he sees the heavens torn apart, not opened, as it says in Matthew and Luke, but ripped apart. If I open a door, I can just as easily close it again. But if something is ripped or torn open, it can never be closed again as easily or perfectly as it was before. There will always be ragged edges or small gaps. This tearing of the heavens is first mentioned in Isaiah 64:1, where it says, "Oh, that you would tear the heavens open and come down to make your name known." Here at Jesus' baptism, Isaiah's cry literally happens. The heavens are torn open and God has come down among us. When the famous Christian writer C.S. Lewis was a young boy, at about around the age of 10, his mother suddenly died of cancer. Lewis's life was ripped apart. Young Lewis lost his childhood faith. His father buried himself in his work and shipped young Lewis off, and they never were able to regain that loving father-son relationship they had had before his mom had died. Later, when he fought in World War I, his best friend was killed and C.S. Lewis was seriously injured, and the fabric of his life was ripped open even more. And yet later, he was able to realize that it was through the ripping of these painful incidences that allowed God to come through. Those tears never healed as neatly as his life was before. And if you're a sewer, you know that the places where something is mended is stronger than the material that surrounds the original tear. So when Lewis's wife also died of cancer just a few years after their marriage, this time Lewis was able to keep his faith, and unlike his father before him, he kept a loving relationship with his stepchildren. From the day he saw the heavens torn apart, Jesus began tearing apart preconceived notions about what a Messiah should or would be. Tearing apart this social fabric that separated the rich from the poor, breaking through hardened hearts to birth compassion and empathy, changing rituals that had lost their meaning through all the rules and laws, changing forever what being the Son of God would mean, tearing down walls that meant that God was only for a select few. When Jesus died on the cross, suspended between heaven and earth, when he breathed his last, that 80-foot curtain from the temple was torn from the top to the bottom, torn from heaven to earth. No longer would God be only approachable one day a year by the high priest. Never again would God be separated from God's people? There is an ancient Japanese tradition that I have forgotten how to pronounce the name. I think it's kintsugi, and it is a Japanese art of putting broken pottery pieces back together with gold after they have been broken. Built on the idea that embracing flaws and imperfections, you can create something even stronger and a more beautiful piece of art. Every break is unique. And instead of repairing an item and trying to make it like new, the 400-year-old technique actually highlights the scars as part of the design. Using this as a metaphor for healing ourselves teaches us an important lesson, I think, that sometimes in the process of repairing things that have been broken, we can actually create something more unique, more beautiful, and more resilient. I pray that that happens in our country after the breaking that happened this past week. Can you look back to those torn places in your own life? We all have them. And now can you look back and see how God's light healed those torn places? And your weakest places actually now become stronger than the surrounding areas. The torn place is still there, the ragged edges, but now God is also there saying, "You are my beloved." I would like to end today's sermon with a prayer by Reverend Barbara Lundblad. It says, "O God, come to us in the torn places where tragedy has broken us, and we can't put everything back together again. Come to us in our hectic pace where we're far too busy to pray or to listen for a whisper. Come to us in the torn place, O God, that we might hear you say, 'You are my beloved child.' And may it be so. Amen."